And good evening. If you are indeed watching this in the evening, this is our Wednesday night Bible study as we are continuing a discussion, an examination of the prophet Daniel, the various world events that occurred, the various prophecies on into the future, but certainly even the prophecies of the immediate future to Daniel, the times that God was testing, that he was disciplining his people, but he also was beginning to open up to the heathen world what was going on. So now we're going to have another golden image. If you remember what happened in the first chapter, we have the exiles coming to Babylon. They were going to be assimilated into the ways of the Babylonians, including their dietary practices. They opted instead to continue doing what God had called them to do as far as the diet was concerned. So they were allowed to do so, and they prospered. They were showing that while they remained faithful to their God remained faithful to them. And then God would work on the world around them and the people around them. So this was going to continue going on through the book of Daniel. So now we have a time where his three companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are going to come into conflict with the king again. But interestingly, in chapter 2, it concludes with the praising of God, the acknowledgement of the God of heaven, by the king, the pagan king, the heathen, the idolater. He was acknowledging God, and now immediately he's going to fall back into his old way. Daniel had interpreted his dream. He had told him what the dream itself was, even though no one else could. And so the king was amazed, and Daniel found favor in his eyes. But now his guys are trying to get at Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And they know that the only way that they can do this is to go through their loyalty to their own God. And so that's precisely the avenue that they try. So they build a golden image. It's 90 feet tall. It's about 9 feet across at its base. It was set out in a plain, so it was very visible from all around. More than likely, according to archaeologists, they believe it was south of Babylon, but it would have been so much that you could stand on the walls of Babylon and gaze out toward it. And 90 feet tall in the future, or in the distance, you would see that massive statue that was overlaid in gold and would just glisten in the sunlight. They appealed to his pride, the pride of an idolater. What more than to build an image of you and call people to bow down and to worship it? It's interesting. Daniel in chapter 2 had interpreted the dream, had told them that in the days of the Romans, that God would establish a kingdom that would last forever. That all of these kingdoms, including Babylon, would be crushed. And yet Nebuchadnezzar rejoiced. In fact, we're told in verse 46 that he bows down and he worships Daniel. And yet now he's going back to this prideful image, this idolatry. This was natural to him. Let's not be so harsh in judging him. This was how he was trained to react and to see the world. Marduk was a chief god, the chief god of the Babylonians. He was also called Bel, B-E-L, but he was also called Merodach. And so Marduk, or Bel, Merodach, he was the equivalent to the Canaanite god Baal. He was a counterfeit god. He was a god who was the creator. He was honored with a yearly festival that celebrated the creation of the universe. He was also proclaimed as a king. And as the living king became more and more loyal to the god, and he conquered nations around him and had more and more conquest and brought the gods of these conquered nations into the temple of Marduk, that Marduk would become more and more powerful, that he would take on the nature of the other gods, and he would take on their characteristics, and those would then strengthen him, and he would become the Lord of the heavens, the monarch that was ruling under this false god was called a son of God, small g. Now, fast forward to the fiery furnace. What does Nebuchadnezzar say? He said, we put 3 in there, but I see 4, and one of them has the appearance like a son of the gods. Now, we immediately in our New Testament minds go to Jesus Christ. Now, I do believe this is the incarnate Christ in there with him. Please make no mistake about that. However, we draw that quick line and say, Son of God. Wow, he was admitting something. No. He was speaking in the terms that he was familiar with. Why? He was the king. And the more he conquered, the more of foreign gods he brought into Marduk's temple, the more he, Nebuchadnezzar, would become a son of the gods. So now he was looking at this fourth person and saying, that is what I am transitioning to. So it's not exactly like we often look at it in the New Testament, but it's very close. But yes, this is God in that fiery furnace. This is the incarnation of God, an epiphany of God and his appearance in human history. The Old Testament prophets mocked Marduk. Go to Isaiah in chapter 46. Here we call him Bel. And if you remember, the Babylonian name that is given to Daniel is Belteshazzar, which is an acknowledgement of Marduk with the prefix of Bel. But in 46, 1 and 2, Isaiah says, Bel, Marduk, bows down, Nebo. Now, interestingly enough, Nebo is where Nebuchadnezzar gets his name. The Nebu at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar is an acknowledgement to Nebo. Nebo is Mercury, or in the Roman pantheon, Hermes, the messenger of the gods. And so this is an astrological thing here, Nebo, and he is the scribe of heaven, and he answers to the Egyptian god Anubis. So Bel, Marduk, bows down. Nebo stoops. Their idols are on beasts and livestock. These things you carry are borne as burdens on weary beasts. They stoop. They bow down together. They cannot save the burden, but they themselves go into captivity. Now, Isaiah prophesied this before the captivity. And so now, understanding that and seeing that and sensing that, we know that this is an acknowledgement that these gods do not have the power. Jeremiah 50, the word that the Lord spoke concerning Babylon, concerning the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Declare among the nations and proclaim. Set up a banner and proclaim. Conceal it not and say, Babylon is taken. Bel, Marduk, is put to shame. Merodach, Marduk, is dismayed. Her images are put to shame. Her idols are dismayed. And going on and predicting the Medo-Persian conquest, the nation from the north that is coming down there. Jeremiah 51 and 47. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, I will punish the images of Babylon. Her whole land shall be put to shame. So the prophets of God, the true and living God, mocked the false gods of the Babylonians. Now we have the trap. The trap is set in chapter 3, verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. The story is old and tried and true. The jealous leaders who did not like Daniel, who did not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because these men did their jobs and did them well. And because they found favor in the eyes of the king, so the jealousy stirred up in these people, and they decided to trap them. How would they trap them? Only in the ways of their gods. So they built this idol. They built this 90-foot tall statue. They acknowledge this is Nebuchadnezzar. This is the God who is becoming a son of God. And that everybody will bow down and worship him. Well, how did they know this would work? What happens as soon as these people come in? They knew that the Hebrews, some of them, were stubborn and were going to stick to the law of their God. And so they decided to play this. Ephesians 4:14, it says, watch out for the schemes of men. And on in chapter 6, it says, we're not unaware, but we're wary of the schemes of the devil. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, Paul says, we're not ignorant of the devices of the devil. He's a schemer. He's a plotter. He's a planner. These guys are doing the bidding of Satan. That's plain and simple. Attacking the people of God. Absolutely. Revelation chapter 12, it says that he is the accuser of men, the deceiver of mankind. And all day long he accuses, attacks the people of God. That is all that's going on here, is Satan is attacking again. And the people of the world are responding to him. They're under his control here. If you look in Ephesians 2, 1 through 7, first couple of verses there, you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. That's why they knew that this would work, is because they were just simply following the schemes of Satan. He knows how to get God's people. Our current circumstance, there is a lot of fertile ground between these guys that are wanting to put on the worship Woodstock version for Easter. Let's gather thousands of people in the midst of all this. And then you've got the other end of that spectrum. The government is forbidding my worship. Folks, let's find some comfortable middle ground there. We can still worship the Lord our God, regardless of the government that we live under and exist under, without having to go to the Woodstock variety. Let's do what we can with what we have during this circumstance. Let's make it through it. But these faithful Hebrew men found themselves in a very similar circumstance. But they had a very serious dilemma that is nowhere near what I think we're facing. Should we obey God rather than men? We can shelter in place and not do anything that disrupts the will of God and his commandments for us. These guys could not. They were not being offered that out. Chapter 3 and verse 8 says they were maliciously accused. Now it's interesting there that it goes on down. It says in verse 12, they pay no attention to you. That was false. These guys served him very well. They served the king faithfully. That was a false statement. But watch what they say next. They do not serve your gods. That's true. They do not worship the image. That also is true. So it was a partially true statement, partially false allegation that was made against them, but it was malicious. They were appealing to the vanity and the pride of the king. First thing they said, they don't pay any attention to you. And the king fell for it. It says in verse 13, he fell into a furious rage. Pride comes before the fall. If you look on down just a few verses later, as you keep on reading this, verse 19 says he was filled with fury. But yet he still gave him another chance. Right there after verse 13, when he comes in, he goes, okay, now, everybody tells me you're not bowing down, but if you'll do it now, you hear the music playing, you bow down now, we're good to go. He gave another chance. But they stuck to their guns. They did what they knew was right. What was their answer? They said, there's no need for us to answer this. God's going to answer the question. It really doesn't matter what we say. God has the last word. No truer words were ever spoken. And brothers and sisters, we need to know that. A thing is not true because we say it. A thing is not true because we believe it. A thing is true because God says it. And that is all we need to know. God would bear them out. They did not know what God was getting ready to do, but they trusted him. Nebuchadnezzar even acknowledged that. They trusted him, and they lived through the fiery ordeal. He cranked that thing up 7 times hotter. It was so hot that his mighty men of valor died dragging Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up to the furnace to throw them in, and yet they were not even touched. Their clothes didn't even smell of the smoke. And then they saw the 4th person in there. They understood that God was going to say whatever God wanted to say, and also understood they might die in this process. Now let's think about that as it relates to this current pandemic that we're living in. Brothers and sisters, somebody in our church family just might die. I don't relish that. It could be me. I don't relish that. I'm not looking to die. but I do know that my life is in the hands of God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had every expectation that they would not survive the fiery furnace, but they trusted God, and he delivered them through this. We'll let God speak for himself, and God provided perfect clarity. God is able, they said. God will do this, they said. But even if he doesn't, we will not bow down, and we will not worship you. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. But it's amazing. That one that had the appearance like a son of the gods, God himself became that man. And he was in there, and he went through the ordeal with them. And Nebuchadnezzar was amazed. He was astonished in all that had been done. He acknowledged the true and living God in chapter 3 and verse 26, and also in verse 28. He is just overcome with the God that saved these young men. He's not broken of his idolatry. He's not broken of his pantheism. But he is now acknowledging again, now for the third time in this book of Daniel, the all-true, all-knowing, all-powerful living God. And he issues a new decree. And in verses 29 and 30 we read, "Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. God is faithful to all. He is a constant. God's faithful servants are faithful to him through all. They are a constant. But the world is going to react in a variety of ways. They may praise God one day and condemn him the next. Use his name in vain one day and praise it the next. The world is the variable. We don't know what they're going to do. But we do know that we can trust God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted God no matter what was going to be the outcome. They were willing to face their physical death because their faith was in the God that gives spiritual life. May be blessed with this story. I hope that you'll read this whole chapter. If you have any questions, give me a text, whatever. We can overcome. We can do this. We can learn. May God bless you.